I'm Stephen Rowe, and you're listening to the Game On podcast.
Past players, past legends, past legends.
Today we're privileged to be speaking to Robbie Neill, aka not the real Bob Neill. We'll get to that. 92-94 at Sydney, 21 games, 9 goals. 96-97, 23 games, 7 goals at St Kilda. Landed at the Parade in 98. So 98 to 05, 134 games, 240 goals, leading goal scorer 5 times, advertiser team of the year 99, 3 state games, and currently, and we will get to that later on, the development role with the female footy with SANFL. Welcome aboard, Robbie.
Thanks, Rulebook, and great to have a chat to you, mate.
Thanks for joining us, mate. We'd like to get a bit of background on our guests, and we'd like to start with some of your junior stuff. Where did you play your juniors, and we'll work in through there?
Yeah, well, I grew up in Canberra, so my mum and dad moved from Melbourne sort of back about 1960 to Canberra with my 2 brothers. They were babies at the time, and anyway, I had another brother, another sister, and me. So there was 5 of us in the family, and given they were from Victoria, footy was, I suppose, in the blood from an early age. And, I attended St Edmunds College as a young kid. And Alex Jezelenko went to school at St Eddie's. And my best mate, Troy Gray, who I played with at Sydney and St Kilda, and he played for West Adelaide as well. So we went to school together there. And, I went through and through all the underage state programs, Teal Cup, etc. And then I was listed by Sydney at the end of 1990, and I was still an under 16 because these were the days where you still had under 19s within the AFL club. So I was listed by the Swans, and then moved up there after I finished year 12 in 91. Moved up there in 92. Had 3 years at the Swans, and then was part of a trade to St Kilda after that as part of the Tony Lockett trade, and ended up there for 3 years.
Oh, you'd wear that as a name to be used in a trade, trade scratcher.
What was life like in the ACT as far as football goes? You know, you sort of think of the Eastern Seaboard there being more rugby heartland. What's the AFL football or Aussie rules football like up there?
Yeah, well, Pete, when I was growing up as a young fella, Canberra was a reasonably transient environment in terms of people coming in and with government jobs, etc. So you had a lot of South Australians, Victorians, Western Australians moving there for work, and plus you had a very strong region in the Riverina and Albury and all the rest of it, and particularly country Victoria. And Canberra clubs had a fair bit of money, so they could pay. They had all the poker machines. Mm-hmm. There's no sort of hoteliers that are making a fortune out of poker machines in Canberra. They're all licensed to community clubs or sporting clubs.
Yep.
So all the money's generated there, so they could sort of fork out a fair bit and retain guys. So, a lot of clubs were paying pretty good money, and there were some really good players running around. A lot of SANFL and VFL players at the time were coming through Canberra pretty much at the end of their careers, but it lent itself to some pretty good footy. So as a young kid, it wasn't uncommon for me to go to Manuka Oval and watch Manuka and Ainsley or Manuka and Eastlake in front of about 10,000 people. So
we had
got some huge crowds in the 70s, in particular, in the early 80s.
Out of that scratcher, we had InterVarsity in Canberra in 85, and functions were at the Ainsley Footy Club, and I just couldn't get over how big that was. You actually walked in. The first thing you saw on the door as you walked in was the photos of this week's side, and they were huge. So like Ford Pocket, Robbie Neill, Pete Matthews, full forward, etc. And so there were pokies there, and then there was a room upstairs, and then another room upstairs where the presentation dinner was seated 600. So it was it was massive, and that was all pokies. Yeah, exactly.
In fact, we had the Mulrooney Medal there. That's how big it was. So the league best and fairest used to be held at the Ainsley Footy Club, and they always had big functions there too. Now, So and sort of outside of Southport is probably especially at that time in the 90s and the early 2000s, probably the richest club outside the AFL. So certainly raising the money, but they had a really good business model. It was a club that generated a lot of money, and as a result was always able to get good recruits. Cowboy Neil coached there. And then another fellow by the name of Brett Hannum, who actually came over and
played for Centrals. Yep.
So Hannum actually coached me back in Canberra as well. Wonderful fella. And so they're able to attract really good players. And footy was in the blood early on, and I had a lot of mates who, whose parents were from other parts of Australia, not necessarily New South Wales or Queensland, but who had footy in the blood as well. And given that I went to a rugby union school, which was probably one of the best rugby union schools in Australia, St Edmunds College, which has sort of produced George Gregan, who's a sort of a mate from school, and Michael Maguire, who's going to coach New South Wales in the State of Origin matches, are sort of in our circle of mates in my year. It was, you had a lot of guys who went on to go and play for the Wallabies, school teachers who were coaches of the Australian schoolboys team. So it was a pretty strong rugby environment. And the footballers, we used to have to sort of fend for ourselves a little bit. We'd do 20K walkathons to raise money for a scrum machine, which probably didn't go down well with the footballers. But that was life, mate, in the ACT, and putting up with the cold, mate, which was another matter.
Yeah, that's true. Who did you debut for Sydney against, Scratcher?
I played against the Brisbane Bears at Carrara back in those days, Mal. So that was the second last round of 92. So I ended up sort of starting on a wing on a bloke wearing number 56. I think he ended up a pretty good player, Michael Voss. So
he did all right.
Yeah, lazy kick
there, mate. He was 16, and he was about 16, I reckon. I was 18. I don't think we'd had a shave between us. So it was a funny game, and we both remember it. And it's quite funny when we used to have a chat to each other, sort of in the cafe down there at Adelaide Oval when Port were training at Adelaide Oval. I'd see him at work. So we remember those days fondly.
Righto, Scratcher. There's one thing here, Pete. This is talking with Robbie. Someone who's been around the traps. It's unusual for me to virtually have my jaw drop. Mm-hmm. And it does from this.
Oh, hang on, breaking news here, mate.
Tell us about the incredible and, I will be honest, insane Sydney training torture session you got put through, Scratcher.
Yeah, that was Gary Buckenara was our coach back in 1992. The poor bugger, he was 34 years of age. He'd been at successful clubs, both in Western Australia, playing the Waffle there, but particularly Hawthorn and won a lot of premierships, So I'd actually made my debut on the Saturday night at Carrara, and we had one game to go, which was the following Friday night, I think, against Richmond. So anyway, after we played the game at the Carrara, I think a few of the boys went out on the Gold Coast, and had a good time and getting home at all hours. And Bucky had sort of seen this happen, and he was probably sick of the culture that was manifesting itself in the footy club. And this is sort of post Dr. Edelson day. So, the money had sort of dried up and things were a bit tight, and probably just the mood around the club had changed a bit. The crowds are dropping off, etc. So on the Monday night, we lobbed up at training, and Bucky said, right, get your gear on, put your runners on. And usually Monday night we used to do a fair bit of running on a Monday night anyway. Like it was, they run the saunas out. But it probably wasn't that scientific. It was more just to get active and get moving. But he took the warm-up, and we jogged a couple of laps of the SCG, and then we ended up sort of near the member stand and out onto Driver Avenue and then into Moore Park. So we're sort of running after Bucky, and it started to rain. And there was a lot of guys who couldn't train, especially the older fella, Stevie Wright. After a game, he's had bone on bone. He couldn't train. Dennis Carroll, a few other guys, who were at the end of their careers. And we ended up going out there, and he said, Roddy, I'm going to give you you've got it easy up in Sydney. The media don't get a hold of you and all this sort of stuff. You've got pretty good weather. I'm going to give you a bit of a taste of what pre-season's going to be like. So we went out there, and there's a grass ski slope next to the Moore Park Bowling Club. And we ran up that. It's probably about 120 metres long.
Yeah.
It's got undulations along sort of as you go. And I reckon we ran up that about 50 times. And you had to do 20 push-ups, 20 sit-ups after each one. And if you end up winning one, you got to the next one to rest. And I reckon I came second or third every time. I just couldn't get a rest. It was just a nightmare. So we kept going, and we did that. And then we ran up at halfway about 25 times. And so we've been out there for about an hour and a half. We got back, and he said, right, and we're jogging back. He said, right, everyone on your stomach. So we got on our stomachs. And he said, crawl back to me. And he kept backpedaling. And it was dark by this stage. And it was just like if you took someone out in the parklands, in the South Parklands or whatever, and just made them crawl. And you're not on the oval. You're sort of actually crawling through the trees. And
they mightn't get back in the South Parklands.
Well,
Right? Keep going.
He probably wouldn't. But anyway, there was sort of pebbles and it was rough grass and all the rest of it. So we did that about 5 times up in the end. You crawl for about 30 metres at a time, and then we ended up back at the SCG. And he said, get out in the oval in pitch darkness. So we went out there, no lights on, just the light that's cast from the members stand out onto the oval, and the trainers are sort of standing there waiting, and for us to be attended to, just a normal Monday clinic.
Yep.
Anyway, we've gone out there and we've done a whole heap of stuff: running 400s, crawling the length of or wriggling the length of the centre square on our backs, which it takes a fair while to do, even in the wet. And a whole range of things for about another hour. Anyway, we've got back into the change rooms, and when we were doing it, I could feel that I was injuring myself, but I was sort of numb, full of adrenaline. I wanted to get through it. I didn't want to show that I was going to give up, and all the boys were the same.
Yep.
And then we sort of got back into the rooms, and I had no skin on my thighs, on my knees.
Wow.
The next day, that night I actually went to bed, and I couldn't take. I had all the wounds dressed, and the trainers were there for a good hour and a half after the session, dressing players, making sure they were clean and all the rest of it. So I had everything strapped up and went to bed, had second skin on and all the rest of it. But overnight, the wounds had actually wet through the bandaging. I had to wear trackie pants to bed because I couldn't take anything off. It was just too sore. Through that and onto the sheets, and I had to sort of peel everything off the next morning. Anyway, I was living at the Swans boarding house at the time, and our landlady, Anna, she was an elderly Irish lady, rang the club and said, look, someone needs to come out and pick Robbie up and take him to the hospital because he's not in a good way. So Michael Byrne, who was our reserves coach, Mick, came and picked me up. And
is that the ruckman?
He was the ruckman, played for Melbourne and Hawthorn.
Yeah.
Yep. Good fella, Mick. And anyway, he drove me out to 5 Dock, out to our doctor, who's his name is George Paponis, and George actually captained Canterbury Bankstown in rugby league. He'd retired by this stage. Anyway, I walked in the clinic and he said, "What the F have you done?" And I said, "Oh, this is a result from training." He said, "I thought you'd been in a motorcycle accident, and you'd actually skidded across bitumen." So that's the injuries that I'd see off that. Anyway, I had everything dressed up and by George. He had to give me tetanus injections, etc. Anyway, I got back to the boarding house. This is on the Tuesday, so it was after the Monday training session. But the Monday was my dad's birthday night. I was going to ring him after training to wish him happy birthday. How you going? This is how training went, whatever. Yep. I didn't ring him, and he sort of wondered why, I think. And I rang the next day once I got home from the doctor and said, "This is what's happened." So he and my mum and my brother drove up from Canberra and picked me up and took me back home because there's no way I wouldn't have been able to play for about 2 months. It was just so bad.
Crazy.
So I didn't play obviously the following Friday night. A few of the other boys were sort of strapped up but weren't moving that well. Needless to say, I think they got a bit of a hiding, but so that was sort of it. And then I had to go back for the best and fairest. I sort of won the runner-up in the reserves, best and fairest that year, and I had to go back to Sydney. But Gary Buckenara actually had to come down to Canberra and see my mum and dad and myself and sort of address the situation. And he knew that he'd made an error in judgment, but he was just, I think he felt really isolated and having done a lot of coaching since, he sort of probably didn't know at that time. Coaches didn't get a lot of support. He was just trying to somehow get everyone to understand that, footies is not. It's a great opportunity that you have. You've got to put everything into it, and I don't think he was sort of sure on actually how to work in an environment such as what we had, given that he'd spent his life in successful clubs and motivated, talented, hard-working people. So it was actually really interesting. And then, probably round 4 the following year, he ended up getting sacked and Ron Barassi took over. So that's how that mess happened.
Wow, that is big. Even my jaw's on the ground now as well.
Yeah.
So
look, to be honest, having done all that, there wasn't a pre-season training session that I knew I couldn't get through. So that was one thing that actually did to me mentally. It probably scarred me a little bit mentally, but certainly there was nothing that was thrown in front of me that I couldn't complete after going through all that.
We'll stick with Sydney. Obviously, your first game is going to be one of the memorable games, but I know you only played 21 for Sydney. Was there another memorable game that you played for Sydney?
Probably the most memorable, I reckon, Pete, was we played Melbourne at the MCG.
When Osborne kicked 10?
No, he didn't. That was at the SCG, actually.
Right.
He kicked 10 that particular day, and it was their first win in ages.
Yeah.
I didn't play in that one. I reckon I might have played in the... No, I might have played in the twos that day. I reckon I was still... Because once that happened with the crawling incident, I went home to Canberra and I didn't come back. I actually went home and played for my club, hoping I was going to have the year in Canberra and then nominate for the draft and go somewhere else. But Sydney said to me, because when Bucky was sacked, Ron Joseph and Ron Barassi took over the club. The AFL pretty much seconded them to Sydney to get things sorted up there. And Ron Joseph said to me, what will happen is that, we'll delist you in June and then take your first pick in the June draft, which will tie you to us for another 3 years. So what I ended up doing is signing a contract and then allowing them to have an extra pick in the draft. So I went back and I was still commuting from Canberra, though. So I sort of played the last 5 senior games of the year for the Swans, but I was also on a couple of occasions playing for my club in Canberra as well. So there were a couple of games where I played an AFL game that same weekend as an ACTAFL game. So the AFL game came first. One was a Friday night, played on a Sunday, and another time I played on a Saturday in Melbourne and played on the Sunday in Canberra. So I was doubling up, which is not advisable now.
No.
Good way to get your game tally up quick, though, Scratcher.
It did. But look, to answer your question, a game at the MCG, we beat Melbourne. They were, I reckon, 9-1 at the time in '94. Had a really good team. I mean, you had Schwartz, you had Lyon playing as forwards.
Tingo,
you had Glenn Lovett, Brett Lovett, Jimmy Steins was playing. You had some wonderful players there, and we played them at the MCG, and it was Dermot Brereton's first game for the Swans after the Raiden Tallis injury, where he got 7 weeks for stepping on his head. And we ended up pulling it off, and because it was Ron's old club as well, and people didn't give us a chance. Only probably maybe 20,000 were at the ground. Even the Melbourne supporters went to the snow that weekend, and we knocked them off, mate. And it was and to do that with the boys, because we were quite a close group at the Swans. Like we all lived with each other. That was probably the thing that makes the club quite unique, is that everyone's from sort of either country, New South Wales, the ACT, or interstate. There weren't many Sydney boys on the list, so everyone seemed to live with each other and in close proximity. So you have no family, you just got each other. So whilst we struggled on the footy field at times, but we were very close because of the friendships that you make just through spending a lot of time with each other. And
then Sydney. So that basically played its part out, which you could see was going to happen. And then off to St Kilda, mate.
Yeah, that's right. I'd started pre-season with Sydney, so I'd already done a week of training. We had a Thursday night off training, and I was at home. My flatmate at the time was Troy Gray, who I just mentioned before, and Troy was back in Canberra. I reckon he might have been uncontracted and was sort of waiting to sign his contract, so he wasn't training. So I was at home, and then I got a knock on the door, and it was Kevin Egan, who was the Swans footy manager, and he said, "Oh, where's Troy?" And I said, "Oh, he's still in Canberra. He's coming back probably shortly once he signs his contract." And he said, "Oh, yeah." He said, "Well, it was actually you I want to speak to." And straight out, it was about 5 o'clock on a Thursday night. He said, "How would you feel about going to St Kilda?" And I said, "What?" And he said, "Look, you probably heard, rumours about Lockett and all that sort of stuff. We've had to do some negotiations with St Kilda to, make sure that we can get the deal done. And they've asked for you as part of the trade. And how would you feel? You've got about an hour to make up your mind, because we need to know tonight because the deadline's 1:30 tomorrow." Wow. And I said, "You're kidding." Anyway, I rang my dad, and he'd already spoken to Stan Owls that day. And I didn't have a manager back then.
No.
No one did really. So it was just sort of your dad or you, So I rang Dad, and he said he spoke to Stan, and he said, "Look, how would you feel about it?" And I said, "Well, I've always sort of wanted to play in Melbourne. I think it'd be pretty good." I had a bit of a row with Ron, sort of about 5 or 6 weeks to go before the end of the season. Anyway, I sort of thought, well, it might be a good idea to actually get out of here. So I ended up, moving down to the Saints, and 95 I had a pretty bad year with injury. I tore a hamstring and then broke my wrist, broke my scaphoid. So that's why I didn't play at all.
Yep.
And then came back in 96, played in an Ansett Cup premiership and had a pretty good year. And then 97 had osteitis pubis most of the year, but I got picked sort of for the grand final. So
yeah, we'll get to that.
Pretty late, yeah.
We'll get to that. So how was it, playing in a St Kilda, the ugliest trophy in the world, but playing in a premiership side, still a pretty big thing in terms of a club starved of success.
Yeah, well, the Ansett Cup too, now, as you probably remember, in 1995 there was a campaign. It was called the SOS Save Our Saints campaign, and we were rattling tins to stay alive. So I'd gone from the Swans, who were on their knees financially, to St Kilda, who are in the same predicament. So, so 1995, I remember at the end of the season, the club didn't have enough money to pay the players their match payments. So we didn't get paid until probably late January. And I remember selling my TV back to my parents so I could buy them Christmas presents. So that was AFL footy back in those days. Like, everyone seemed to think blokes were big money. It certainly wasn't the case. No. So 1996, when we won the Ansett Cup, I think we won. The prize money might have been, maybe just over $100,000.
That's what I reckon it was. Yeah.
And winning it was our focus. It was like, okay, we want to get members. Membership's a really important part of our business plan, and we want to win the money as well. So we put everything into it to win it, and we beat sort of Hawthorn round one pretty well. Played the Crows over here, had a win. Played West Coast, had a win, and then we played Carlton in the final, who were the premiers the previous year. They had a couple of guys out. Diesel didn't play, and I think Braddles might have played either. But, we had a pretty young team, but led brilliantly by Stewie Lowe, Nathan Burke, Rob Harvey. Nicky Winmar was best on ground. And we got over the line, and we beat them by about 10 goals, so we had a pretty good win. But that was the start of us actually to starting to get things together at St Kilda. We'd started with leading teams, and we'd start putting that leadership program in, and it bore the fruit for the next couple of years to come.
Because you had a pretty reasonable year in 96 too.
St Kilda, yeah.
Yeah, no, but you personally.
We just finished outside the finals. We finished 10th, I think, and we sort of had to win maybe the last game of the year against Hawthorn. We got done, but yeah, it was sort of by the end of the year, we're actually quite tired. We put so much emotionally into early in the year, and we had a pretty young team. We're a bit buggered, so we ended up sort of finishing, unfortunately. But yeah, the motivation going into the next pre-season was huge, and it was the biggest pre-season I've ever done. It was bloody hard, and and we reaped the benefit though. The running and the lifting and all the rest that we did. We'd gone from sort of being not so much me. I mean, I'd been in the system a while, so I was naturally pretty strong. And by then I'd done a few pre-seasons, but, guys, particularly Barry Hall, turned into a monster.
Yeah.
Even guys like, Joel Smith put on weight, Tony Brown, Ozzie Jones, Andrew Thompson, Maxie Hudgton, those sorts of guys just really started to develop. Jason Cripps at that time as well. So the younger brigade, Darryl Wakeland as well. He could now start to really compete against the best forwards physically. So we just started developing a team. When teams came up against St Kilda, they knew they could see us change enormously physically. So they were almost like, these guys mean business now. So and 97, the way the season panned out certainly proved that.
Was Robert Harvey as fanatical as what we saw from over the border here with his football?
Oh hell yeah. Harves is, he's unreal and very like-minded. I mean, I played with Anthony as well, and obviously Mal knows Anthony really well from his time captaining in Norwood. Different species in terms of, their build and all the rest of it. Ant's a lot slighter than Rob. But, in terms of, I'd only seen one guy break Anthony Stevens in a game, and that was Rob, in terms of endurance and running, to the point where, Steve-O didn't want to go with him anymore. And he was an animal.
And look, while we're briefly chatting with Robert Harvey, we'll get back to you with 97. But full respect with Robert Harvey, 97, St Kilda have lost the grand final. He could have easily gone, bugger, that's the end of footy. Mm-hmm. He was over watching Norwood the next week to Anthony and up in the Redlegs Club afterwards, and that when we were upstairs in those days and all that, he was blown away. He said, there's as many people here as we would have had if we'd won it. And, so out of that. But look, back on a 97 scratcher. So you've played the first 2 games. As you said, you had problems with osteopubis and that. Then you've ended up – did you suspect you were a chance to play in the finals and in the grand final, or where did that all eventuate from?
Yeah, what ended up happening, Mel, so to take you back, round 2, we played Brisbane at the Gabba, and my groins had shot, and they'd been pretty bad for about a month throughout the NSET Cup because we wanted to win that again, didn't win more money. And by round 2, I'd played 10 games, and that's unheard of. So if you can imagine a player finishing round 2 and having played 10 games already for the season. So, and with that, I reckon we'd travelled interstate about 6 times as well. So, and as I said, we had the biggest pre-season of all time. So by round 2, my groins are shot. So I ended up having sort of 5 weeks off. And I was having cortisone injections right in your pubic symphysis. I never felt so vulnerable in all your life, mate, with a needle sort of down there, I tell you. So I used to go into the city bars every couple of weeks to get them done. Then I came back for about 5 weeks and it flared up again, had another 5 off. And then I came back and then I started playing reasonably well. But the hardest thing, mate, all I used to do was get like just almost a fistful of Tiger Balm and just rub it through the groins and all the rest of it and just deal with the burn. But somehow it used to sort of take the pain away from the actual OP until you cool down afterwards. But I sort of got through. But what Stan had done is that the team, and mind you, St Kilda we were 1-6 after 7 rounds.
Yeah.
97.
Yeah.
1-6. And the only win was against Collingwood in round 3. So we didn't start well. And then won about 13 of the next 14 games after that. Maybe with 1 loss to the Bulldogs. But what happened was, with about 6 weeks to go, Stan said, right, he paired guys off and sort of said, right, if we lose so-and-so, then so-and-so is coming in. And he kept it pretty streamlined in terms of what selection was going to be. And my partner was Matty Young. So I was in the 2s. Youngie was playing. And, it would be, Darryl Wakeland, David Sierakowski. It'd be, Brett Cook, Lazar Vidovic or something like that, or Spider Everett, whatever. So he had everyone sort of paired off. And then, it sort of got to a stage down to the grand final. Coming in, we beat Brisbane first round of the finals. In the seniors, our reserves made the finals but got knocked out. So I played up pretty well in that and leading up into that. Then we had a week off, and then it was the prelim final, and it was pretty wet. And Stan rang me the afternoon of the game and said, because it was Friday night, he said, look, I think you might be playing tonight. We might go pull a tall out and play you. And I said, oh, no worries. He said, bring your gear to the game, make sure you're ready, all that sort of stuff. So I did. About an hour before the game, he said, no, we're going to go in as selected. So went up to the stand, and then obviously the boys blew North Melbourne away. And then, in the rooms, it was pretty hard afterwards. It was sort of like, far out, we're going to miss out on this, the boys who didn't play. You're happy for the guys, but you're sort of, everyone goes into their own sort of, I suppose, self-reflection and,
what if,
the circumstances. And because St Kilda making a grand final doesn't happen every year, let's face it. So we were thinking about what was going to happen. But what had happened is Matty Young had been in rehab with me quite a bit throughout the year. He was getting himself up for games, but he was having epidurals in his back. He had a really bad back. And Young and I, we got really well. Like we did a lot of training together in rehab as well. And just to get himself up for games was amazing that whole year. But his back seized up in the prelim, and he couldn't sort of get off the bench to get out there. And I don't think Sam trusted him to be able to get through a grand final, get through the week and play in the grand final. So, and I was his direct replacement. But I remember driving home from the game. I stopped into the Shell Servo on Punt Road, and I ran into Bob Skilton. And I knew Bob from when I played at the Swans, so we used to come to a lot of past player things and come and speak to us and all that sort of stuff. And he said, you never know, son, what might happen this week. Someone might drop out. And I'm like, I don't know, Bob. Anyway, see you later. Thanks for the well wishes. And anyway, unfortunately for Youngie, he wasn't able to get up, and I was his direct replacement. But I didn't find out until our team meeting late on the Thursday night. So before a Saturday game.
Okay, now.
Well, do you think that was a good thing? Not knowing?
Oh, probably. But you had all these people in your ear going, I think you're in it. And because Stan had sort of made the point, if someone's out, you're in. It was sort of, no one would sort of tell you. But I I just made sure I'd prepared as well. But the other thing, what I didn't know is that I didn't know what role I was going to be able to play during the game. Like it was sort of, you start on the bench, and then I ended up only playing sort of the last 4 minutes of the second, third, and fourth quarter. So I only played about 12. In total. So you sort of just got on there, and you didn't really have a sort of a sense of belonging, really, with what you're doing. I sort of felt that way anyway, and that was the game. Sort of played a bit like that way. You know, there were some guys who never even got out on the ground. In particular, when you had Rob Harvey, Burke, and all the rest of it, they played 100% game time all the time. They wouldn't come off unless they were in a blood rule or something, So the rotations were a lot more reduced back in those days, and that was the way the game was played.
So then you've played in the grand final, seemingly almost been the scapegoat, because how in the hell did you get delisted after being selected for the grand final?
I don't know, but funnily enough, Ron Joseph, who obviously was our administrator at the Swans, he ended up taking over our general manager football role. He became a player manager. He left the Swans after sort of Ron Barassi, so end of 95. And he was actually sort of my player manager for that year. And I said to Ron, look, my contract had expired at the end of 97, and I was looking to sign again. And I ended up training for 5 months uncontracted because of the year I had.
I thought there was something weird, yeah.
I trained uncontracted, and because of the year I had, I didn't really have any sort of weight to be able to go and play standoff, you know what I mean? So I had to go to training every I had to, because but at the same time I was ringing Ron going, well, what happens if I do my knee? All the rest of it, I'm stuffed, you know what I mean? And the other thing, I had my personal training business at the footy club. So I had a small room and a studio set up, and Troy Gray and myself had it. And I'd work at another place, another big gym called the King Club, which is a bit similar to, say, the Arc at Campbelltown. It was big for that time. Trevor Barker, who passed away a couple of years prior, used to be the centre manager, and I worked there. And I also had my own PT business as well. So I had my business at the club. And anyway, I got through that. And then after Christmas, I said to Ron, look, this is getting a bit too close. We're playing trial games soon, and I'm not sure what I should do. So he rang the club, and the club said, look, yep, no worries. And he rang me back and said, look, they're stuffing around. I want you to go into AFL House and nominate for the draft. And I said, no, I want to play for St Kilda. I don't want to play anywhere else.
Yeah.
So he said, look, I'll ring you back in 5 minutes. So he rang back 45 minutes later and said, no, we're all sorted. Next week we're sitting down and we'll sign him next week. I said, oh, thank God.
Yep.
Anyway, I went to training the next week. We did a morning training session, and Stan Nels said, Rob, can you come upstairs, have a chat? No rush, mate. Just when you have a shower, whatever, come upstairs and see me. So I went upstairs. And this is the 10th of February by this stage. And I had played in a couple of internals by that stage. And he said, mate, the club made a decision late last night to list you. And I was gobsmacked because I lost my two forms of income there and then.
Yeah.
And I said, right, what the hell do I do now? And he sort of went on and said, look, your leadership's been, great for a young guy, all that sort of stuff, those budding you up and then basically send you on the way.
Yep.
I have a lot of respect for Stan. Stan's a wonderful man. He's a terrific fella, Stan Nels. But you're just not in a position to be able to sort of process all that. At that time, particularly, February, I'm thinking, what do I do? So, so I walked out, sat in the car for about an hour out in the car park, trying to work it out, what I'd do. Rang Ron Joseph, said, this has happened. He was shocked. So what I don't know is whether Ron had some dialogue with him and he made maybe some sort of threat towards him and said, look, if this doesn't happen, he'll do this and whatever. And I'm not sure whether they got angry with it. I don't know. I've heard that story off a couple of people who were board members. But I still don't know to this day what happened. And anyway, I found out, I was out. And what had happened though, now is that clubs had committed to guys throughout the pre-season. We'll take you in the pre-season draft. So, let's say Jason Dalchenko was North Melbourne, he went to Hawthorn, and they said, you train with us and we'll pick you. So there was only so many picks in the draft, and guys had already been committed to guys. So when I came out in February, I couldn't go anywhere. So Andy Collins rang me and said, would you come down to Sandringham? So I trained down at Sandringham for 3 weeks. I knew a few guys who'd played at St Kilda before who were down there. And then Glenn Rosso rang me. And funnily enough, Glenn Rosso had Troy Gray's number. He was trying to get Troy to play there. Troy got delisted in October.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I do remember that now.
I actually gave him Troy's number, but because he rang me, he had my number by this time and he kept it. So he rang me in February and said, how would you feel about coming to Adelaide? We'll come over for a train and whatever. And I said, oh, yeah, why not?
Liking this podcast? Please like, rate, and subscribe.
We thank Robbie for his time there. We're going to split that interview, obviously, into two halves because we thought it was only going to be about a 30-minute interview, but we went well and truly over that.
I knew Scratcher way too well for that to be the case, Pete. Yeah.
Absolutely.